Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Bridget Nelson. On this episode, Elaine Kub discusses corn and soybean prices. Justin McMechan talks about early insect scouting. Strahinja Stepanovic shares information about the upcoming Nebraska Extension Field Days. And Chris Proctor talks about early weed management. Elaine Kub is our market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture reports that 81% of the nation's corn crop has been planted, and 50% of the crop has emerged. Meanwhile, the nation's soybean crop is 56% planted, with 26% overall emerged. Corn prices showed highs in both July and December futures this week, while soybean prices continue to be bullish. There is still no guarantee that trade tensions are over between China and the U.S. However, according to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, China has agreed to increase purchases of U.S. farm and energy products. In the near future, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross will be traveling to Beijing to further discuss trade. We talked with Elaine Wednesday morning about these uncertain trade issues, but began by asking her about the recent USDA crop progress report.
Yeah, nationwide they said 81% in the Monday report, so by now it's effectively virtually complete. And there certainly are some isolated areas where they did have very wet weather this spring, where there was frustration, certainly in that Wisconsin, Michigan tier areas of northwest Iowa and southeast South Dakota were also fairly late, and there's some frustration there. But given the overall forecast, the weather forecast, generally speaking, or nationwide speaking, there's not going to be a major late planting concern. It was a tighter window this year, certainly because the beginning of everything was late because of how cold the spring was. But generally speaking, the seed will be in the ground. The grain will get started here with fairly favorable weather conditions.
Yeah, because according to the report, we're about 20% almost done with corn. But then up north, where you are in South Dakota, you guys are about 20% behind Nebraska.
Yeah, so there was, like I mentioned, some wet weathers in some spots in eastern South Dakota. But, rain makes grain, right? Just because it was late or because there was frustration getting it in at a certain time doesn't mean it won't get in and doesn't mean it won't grow. So you worry about that. And then the bigger worry, I think, from that eastern South Dakota area where there was the late planting or somewhat late planting, is the spring wheat. So you see the spring wheat planting numbers are really quite far behind their 5-year averages, and that spills over into Minnesota also. And that to me suggests that there's going to be some spring wheat fields that just won't be planted. And that was something that was always going to be the concern when we had that very cold spring and very late start to planting. And I think that's playing out, and we're just kind of seeing it in those crop progress numbers, and it won't officially show up in any sort of supply and demand table until it ends up as an acreage number.
Along with spring wheat, there's also the soybeans. There's been a lot of talk about soybeans with China. There's still no guarantee that trade discussions are going to be finalized with the U.S. and China. Tell me a little bit more about how that's going to affect the market.
Bridget, you are so right to point out there is no guarantee, right? From one day to the next, we really don't know what the final outcome will be of all of these rumors. But as we are taping this right now, the inclination is, or the thought is, that the two countries are going to work things out and not initiate these tariffs, this 25% tariff against U.S. soybeans going into China. China has declared that it is not in the public's best interest to have these feed grains or the soybeans have higher prices. So That is very optimistic to me, and we see that in the futures markets. We see the November soybean price coming back towards that 1060 level where it was right before the day before all of this tariff talk got started. So to see that equilibrium be reestablished, that's very hopeful. And if the hopefulness of these tariff talks can get finalized, then I think the soybean market will really have a chance to reflect perhaps longer term demand growth.
And with the soybean market, do you think Brazil and Argentina are going to affect that as well?
I think absolutely. I mean, they always do. But at this point, we don't have a big story coming out of Brazil or Argentina from the soybean side. We're still a little bit focused on the Brazilian second crop of corn. There is still some potential for some bullishness there. They have had a dry spell here these past couple of months, but in the near-term forecast, there's just enough rain to keep the market from really exploding there. But that's really the story coming out of South America at the moment.
Yeah, going on with corn. Corn hasn't really changed much since like the first week of May, right?
Yeah, it's a much quieter market than soybeans, that's for sure. But I will point out that the last time I looked at my screen, December corn was at 425, so it reached sort of a new high here, and that's a pretty favorable price. That's certainly something that folks should be keeping their eye on.
What do you expect with corn throughout the summer? How do you think weather is going to influence?
This is the time of the year when I know farmers and marketing decisions is probably not the top thing on their mind. Getting things planted and getting weeds sprayed is probably the top things on their mind. But this is absolutely the time of the year when we shouldn't be putting things off or shouldn't be ignoring it. There are some times of the year where you always kind of know, well, probably nothing's going to happen. We're probably not going to reach our seasonal highs. But this is the time of the year. May, June, July, you've really got to have a plan in place or an expectation to get some things sold, because when we are faced with what we have here in 2018, broadly favorable planting, broadly favorable long-term forecasts, probably a reduction in the drought scenario or the dryness scenario in southern Iowa, all of that has to point to an expectation that we will have a very large crop and therefore lower prices at harvest. So absolutely, I think folks should be looking for seasonal highs here in the next 6 weeks.
Along with corn, wheat has been experiencing a lot of weather impacts. Spring wheat is actually almost planted, like you mentioned in the crop progress report update. But tell me a little bit more about how wheat is being affected.
Yeah, wheat has seen some higher prices here. That KC wheat contract reflecting the still dry weather for the southern plains. In Kansas, obviously, still has a lot of drought, Oklahoma as well. So that is somewhat reflected in those futures prices, but there's another scenario where the sort of short-term forecast or the 7 to 10-day forecast gives just enough weather, just enough precipitation for certain areas to keep the market from exploding. So I'm more interested in seeing the spring wheat prices, reestablish the premium that they historically hold over the winter wheat prices, which we have not seen. I don't feel that concern that I have about spring wheat acreage is fully priced into that market yet.
Next week, Mississippi State Extension livestock economist Josh Maples will join us to look at cattle markets. Now that crops are planted and are now starting to emerge, it is time for producers to start scouting for insects. According to Justin McMechan, Nebraska Extension cropping system specialist, some of the most common early insects found in corn and soybeans can be due to pest infiltration of cover crops. Although cover crops provide many benefits, it is important to make sure pests do not exist after termination. We talked with Justin last week at the Field Crop Scout training to learn more on how to scout and control insects during the early development stages of corn and soybeans.
So corn and soybeans just went in here recently, but on the soybeans, really the big thing to look out for is seed corn maggots, and those are typically tied to high manure applications or cover crops that are being terminated with tillage. What it is decomposing residue. They're attracted to that residue, and they lay eggs and then develop. Now most producers are using seed treatments, and so they're probably pretty clear from that kind of issue. Some other things that we've had a lot of cool temperatures this spring. I think everybody's been worried about that. Second coldest temperatures on record for April. And so things like wireworms are staying high in the soil profile until things warm up. And so that's one to look for. They're really hard to scout for, but a producer could go out and dig down about 3 to 5 inches and out about 10 inches and lift that soil over and look. It's the kind of thing you do prior to planting. So if they planted fields already, it's not really anything they can do now. But on that case, if they find a large number, it would be worth adding a seed treatment or going with some foliar in-row insecticides. The last one on soybeans early season is bean leaf beetle. And everybody's probably pretty familiar with bean leaf beetle. It's out in alfalfa fields and other areas, but as those fields either get cut or other things, they're going to move into soybeans. And so if you planted a really early soybean field this year, that's the field I would look at first. The later ones, probably not likely as much of a problem. And those bean leaf beetles, they're pretty hard to scout for. You just got to be careful. So as you walk along the row, look at the leaves, do it early in the morning when the sun's shining on the leaves, and sometimes you can see them through the leaf. And so that's one where defoliation-based estimates for whether or not those need to be treated for.
In addition to seed corn maggots, bean leaf beetles, and wireworms in soybeans, it is also important to scout for certain insects during the early development stages of corn.
Corn's a whole different beast. There's a lot of things going on in corn. We've been tracking some new pests. Wheat stem maggot was one, so if producers and consultants have been following us, that showed up last year in the spring around this time. The next couple weeks is when we started getting phone calls. We found it this spring. April 16th it started showing up in cover crop fields. So it was here prior to us terminating a lot of our cover crops. And I recommend consultants and growers to scout those fields. It's very hard to sweep cover crops, and we don't have any recommendations on whether or not they should apply an insecticide. I definitely don't recommend they apply one when they terminate, because this insect secludes itself within the stem of the cover crop and is not likely to abandon for 10 or 11 days after termination with Roundup. So if they really are scared about that type of thing, they should delay their insecticide application to 10 or 11 days post herbicide application. Lots of other insects in corn systems. Certainly wireworm, as I mentioned earlier, it attacks corn just like it attacks soybeans. Again, a hard one to scout for. Worth looking for because it has so many years of generations that if you find it this year, then you can do something about it next year. And with the cold profile that we've had, they've been high. Next year it might be warm this time of the year when they plant, and they may be well down into the soil profile. It might not be a problem. So again, soil temperature plays a lot with that one. Stink bugs are another one in corn, and so brown stink bug overwinters in this state. It's also attracted to cover crops. I work in cover crops, so hear a lot of cover crop references. Cover crops are good, it's just they need some added management. So they can be present in the system this time of the year. They can damage corn from the time it germinates all the way through until just before harvest. And so I recommend people scout, especially if they were planting during wet conditions and left the furrows open. They can get right down into where that furrow is and cause damage to corn. And they'll continue all throughout the season. Any shot hole appearances through the leaves while you're out in the field scouting is a good sign that you've probably had some stink bug damage in the field. So those are kind of some of the main early season pests. We've had some numbers of black cutworm show up in this state. So this is another early season pest. I captured roughly 10 in the course of 3 nights, so that's just under threshold. We're not really sure when they showed up during those 3 nights. But if we hit 8 or more black cutworm over 2 nights, I would tell agronomists and others that are out in the field roughly 350-degree days later to start scouting. Even before that actually is fine, and they'll find little cuts in the leaves, and then as they reach that 350-degree day mark, they'll start cutting plants off at the soil surface, and so that's a big concern. One well worth scouting for this year, and certainly if we start to see it, we'll be posting things on it. Typically with that one, it's temperature driven too, like a lot of insects. If we're down around 60 degrees Fahrenheit for the next 5 days and you're seeing cutting, that should be more concerning. They'll consume more plants as they go through their development. If it's 80 degrees on average each day, they're only going to cut a few plants. So that's a tough one. You can apply insecticides for it. There are thresholds. 3 to 5% cut requires an application to be made. There'll be lots more things in the coming weeks, and definitely keep an eye on us for what we might find in the field.
You can stay updated on the latest pests of 2018 by going to the CropWatch website at cropwatch.unl.edu. June is going to be a busy month. According to Strahinja Stepanovic, Nebraska Extension Cropping Systems educator, there are going to be 7 Nebraska Extension Field Days taking place on the 12th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd of June. At the field days, participants will have the opportunity to learn more about different wheat varieties, field peas, chickpeas, and forages. In addition, depending on the field day location, participants will also be able to learn about other specialty crops such as lentils and winter canola. We talked with Strahinja on Monday to learn more about these field days and why he thinks eastern Nebraska farmers should consider adding field peas to their crop rotation.
June field days have been traditionally evolved around wheat. This year, as I think eastern Nebraska is getting a little bit of a taste of western Nebraska with bringing in pulse crops. to that part of the state and bringing in a little bit of diversity to a mix. So not only that we're going to learn more about winter wheat varieties across the states, we're going to have opportunities to learn about how varieties of field peas, both yellow and green, chickpeas and lentils work across the state. That's only on variety side. At some locations, we're going to have forages and cover crops also in the plots. And besides the varieties and only looking at the crops, we're going to have a different agronomic research that's going to be showing how different planting dates, seeding rates affect either wheat or these other pulse crops. So that's kind of unique, I would say, a joint effort, not only on the genetic side, but also on how to grow the best crop.
By teaching eastern Nebraska farmers on how they can incorporate pulse crops into their crop rotation, Strahinja hopes field pea processors will notice the growth of pulse production and add more processors throughout Nebraska.
It's, like I said, in eastern Nebraska, getting a little taste of western Nebraska in terms of diversity. How they fit in our rotations, that's number one. In western Nebraska, we have fallow because we don't have enough rain to grow crop every year. Fallow has been fantastic water conservation practice, so we try to intensify that rotation by replacing fallow with pulses, either field peas or chickpeas or lentils. They are short season crop. As you go further east, you get more rain. People are starting, in central Nebraska, they're starting to think about replacing soybeans. And especially for the guys that grow wheat, corn, soybean rotation, they observe that if they put field peas and they're a little bit shorter season, they can get a good crop, better than what we do in the west, and then get the wheat planted on time, and wheat does better after peas than it does after soybeans in central Nebraska. Now in eastern Nebraska, or irrigated acres in western Nebraska, with the field peas and winter wheat, you have an opportunity to incorporate do double cropping, either with the short season crops or maybe with the forages or cover crops. And if you do forages and cover crops, then you can also potentially bring a cattle to the land and enhance that nitrogen cycle, especially if you go with the cover crops behind peas. Nitrogen fixer being peas, then you plant the cover crops, then you have cows grazing, fertilizing that field for the next year, and you get some gain off of that. And then you go cut your inputs back next year. So it's a cropping systems approach to this. So how they fit throughout the state, it's really different. And we're going to try to address that research and get more research-based recommendations for that in the future.
Pulse crops are different than corn, soybeans, and wheat since they involve an industry where growers will need to work one-on-one with these processor companies.
There's one thing that I want to say it's unique about these field days, that not only are we going to have a field visits, we have lots of new crops that people are not familiar with. We're going to have an indoor sessions where we're going to have pulse crop industry leaders. This is a little bit different than corn, soybean, and wheat because this pulse crop processors, ingredients companies, and pet food industry, they want to know farmer face to face. It's a lot more about direct marketing. The price, the premiums are a little bit higher than for wheat. On top of my head, field peas are $7 a bushel right now. Lentils are about 13, and chickpeas about 23, 24. That may not be but that's kind of a range where they are right now. And there's a lot of progressive companies like Farmer Business Network or Farm Leads that offer a marketplace for them. They put the contracts together. They figure out where to store them, whether to pick them on a farm. They have production contracts in place. And I would encourage everybody to come in and during the networking session talk to all those companies. Redwood Group, Gavilon Grain. There's a lot of people that have interest coming in Nebraska and processing pulses, connecting to a grower. So that's why this industry is really, really unique.
To pre-register for the Nebraska Extension Field Days, go to the CropWatch website at cropwatch.unl.edu. The Nebraska Field Pea Field Days are also free to attend. It goes without saying that today's hybrids generally out-yield those of 10 or 20 years ago. In 2017, agronomists at the Monsanto Water Utilization Learning Center near Gothenburg performed tests involving 5 older DeKalb corn products and 6 newer products to see what had been gained after years of breeding, in terms of how these hybrids performed under stress. To test the differences, researchers imposed several different kinds of stress on the plants, such as drought stress and density stress. In conclusion of the study, across all environments, results showed a 28 bushel advantage for newer corn products. You can learn more about this study in the May Nebraska Farmer. Not only is it time to scout for insects, but also for weeds. According to Chris Proctor, Nebraska Extension Weed Management Educator, Marestail is already being discovered in some Nebraska fields. Marestail, also known as horseweed, is an annual weed that can follow a winter or summer annual life cycle. We met with Chris last week to learn more on how to control Marestail and other weeds that can appear throughout the growing season.
So right now, one of the weeds that's around is Marestail, so winter annual. So in Nebraska, it primarily comes up in the fall. You get a little bit of spring emergence, but most of it came up last fall. But right now is a great time to manage that. It's still relatively small, it's still a rosette. So you want to manage it well before it bolts. Once it bolts and starts to go into its reproductive stage, it's a lot more difficult to manage. So this is a great time, if you haven't managed it in the fall, to get out and try to manage Marestail if you know you have some.
Marestail is one of the common weeds found in Nebraska, but there are other weeds to scout for during the early development stages of corn and soybeans.
Yeah, so we're starting to see some of the ragweeds are emerging. So those are kind of some of the early emerging summer annuals, as well as some of the lamb's quarters are starting to come up. I've seen some of that. Some of the early emerging, like sunflowers, will start to come through. We're still a little bit early for some of the later emerging weeds like the pigweeds, but it's not going to be long. I think with the weather we're having, we'll start seeing some of those coming on as well.
With the possibility of marestail, ragweed, and other types of weeds taking over one's crop, it is important to practice proper weed management.
Yeah, so I think one of the keys is to manage them when they're small. So with all these difficult to control weeds, you want to catch them 3-4 inches or smaller. Your success goes up a lot when you're managing them at that size. With something like Marestail, I think managing it early, so it's kind of hard to wait too much longer to manage that because it's going to progress faster than some of the later emerging weeds. And so if you know you have a Marestail problem, something like 2,4-D or dicamba is actually a really good product. For folks that are growing some of the new dicamba beans, it's a good opportunity to be able to spray some dicamba without having that plant back restriction to the soybean. So that's a good opportunity there as well to manage Marestail.
If producers do not apply pre-emergence herbicides prior to planting, Chris recommends those producers to apply the herbicide right away once the crop is in the ground.
So I would certainly encourage those that can to get a pre-emerge down. So if you've planted but you haven't emerged yet, you have about 2 or 3 days to get something down with a pre-emerge. And that's really going to make a big difference as you go into the season because it gives you that longer residual control. So any kind of pre-emerge herbicide is important. Otherwise, it's scouting and trying to catch those weeds with the post-emerge application before they get to that 3 to 4 inch stage. Once they get much bigger than that, in-crop, a lot of our in-crop herbicides are less effective than our burn down or our pre-emerge herbicides, and so it becomes a lot more challenging. So timing is really critical.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, most of the major precipitation, the heaviest precipitation, fell north of the I-80 corridors. We had, of course, the storm system moving in last weekend, and then we had several rounds of thunderstorm activity this week. As we have this weak trough in the upper atmosphere to the west, it really has no big dynamic push to it, meaning it's not moving very rapidly toward the east, and so we see these diurnal thunderstorm activity kicking up on a daily basis across the state. Unfortunately, the areas of south, central, and southeast Nebraska missed out on a significant portion of the precipitation that fell north of the I-80 corridor. Therefore, we've increased moderate drought conditions into portions of southeast Nebraska, including portions of Gage County, Saline County, Jefferson County, and Fillmore County, and continuing on into the future. If we do not receive significant moisture, I would expect that we'll see further expansion of this over the next week to 2 weeks, and we'll take a closer look at this next week with the drought monitor. So in terms of precipitation, there are chances for precipitation, although weak. We do have those chances, so let's take a look at the upper atmospheric pattern and how it may progress this week. We have a ridge at the surface, we have a trough to the west, and this confluence zone is where most of the major precipitation activity has been going as it runs around the ridge. We have surface lows basically all the way along the High Plains region, and that's going to help evac some moisture toward the north, but there's just no trigger to really work on it, so most of the activity will be over the northern Rockies in the southeastern United States. Now, as we go into tomorrow, this low pressure system begins to make a slow movement toward the Central Plains, so we still have low pressure at the surface on the lee of the mountains. That will at least bring some moisture up and interact with the tropic over the northern Rockies, but the dominant feature will still be the tropical activity over the southeastern United States. On Monday, this trough starts to open up somewhat, starts to move into the Central Plains, and so the surface lows to our south may actually have enough moisture to start pumping up and interacting with this trough, and indeed the models are showing precipitation breaking over the northern Rockies and into northwest Nebraska, and that will probably shift through the state during the overnight hours and into Tuesday as that trough makes its way up into the northern plains. So you see the surface low associated with that trough. We still have 2 more lows down toward our south that will help increase the moisture feed. So our best chance for widespread precipitation on Tuesday will be the eastern half of the state, and then that will exit out to the Great Lakes as surface ridging starts to build in and the trough moves over into the Ohio River Valley. High pressure is a dominant feature of the central Rockies with the surface low to our south, and that will help feed moisture into that troughing pattern over the Great Lakes in the eastern United States. And as we get into the day on Thursday, this ridge starts to build up even farther toward the north, bringing much warmer conditions once again back into the Central Plains. So we will be dealing with heat, humidity, and the potential for thunderstorm activity. Although it looks to be weak, there is some signs that maybe some thunderstorm activity over eastern Nebraska. And then as Friday comes around, we see that ridge really building toward the north. We're probably looking well into the 90s across a substantial portion of the central and southern plains. Surface lows to our west once again, but most of the moisture stays off to the east and interacts with the trough moving across the northern United States. So that's where the heaviest precipitation shield is. And if we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday through the following Tuesday, above normal temperatures, and in terms of precipitation, back to a dry trend.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, early insect scouting, Nebraska Extension Field Days, and early weed management. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Josh Maples will be our cattle market analyst and will recap the USDA's May Cattle on Feed report. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Bridget Nelson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.